All right. So if you guys remember, when we last met, we were talking about body composition. And so we had looked at all of these pretty maps and talked about the obesity rates increasing and why those might have happened over the last 30 years. We talked about how wellness and body fat went together, how too much is a bad thing, but also how too little could affect our health. And then I believe where we left off was we talked about BMI and body mass index, and how it was an easy calculation, but it didn't paint a whole picture. It told us how much weight you had compared to your height, but didn't tell us about the quality of that, if it was muscle or fat or bone or what was going on. And so was helpful, but wasn't the greatest measure of health as it comes to what our body's made up of, our body composition. So where we're headed now is we want to talk about percent body fat. We've talked a lot about what it is and how it's good for our health, but we really haven't talked about how do we get that? Like, how would we be able to determine mine or your percent body fat? It's a lot more complicated than BMI, which is why it's not always used quite as much. A lot more goes into it because we have to actually look at your body and what it's made up of. We can't just look on the outside. We kind of have to look at the inside. And so when it comes to percent body fat and how we calculate your percent body fat, whether you're 10% body fat, 20% body fat, 100% body fat, which you're not going to be 100%, but how do we do that? We've got two different ways we could kind of look at that. And so we have the direct method and the indirect method. So we'll talk about the direct method first. The direct method of body composition, it says can't be done here, but it can be done, and it actually is done, but it's not maybe necessarily the most practical way to measure the percent body fat. And so I'll describe those two. There are two different ways we can look at your direct percentage of body fat. And then after I'm done describing it, I'll kind of let you guys tell me why maybe that isn't done very often and why that's not the most practical way to do things for maybe to figure out your percent body fat. So the direct ways of body fat, the first way we do this is realize anytime we start looking at percent body fat, one of the first pieces of information we need to know about you, regardless of the test, is we need to know your body weight. So the first thing we're going to do is weigh you. After we weigh you, and the first way to get direct percent of body fat is we're going to put you basically on a table, and we're going to go through with a knife and cut out every piece of fat that we can find. Every small little piece of fat, we're going to cut it away and basically put it into a basket. We're going to go through the entire body, head to toe, and cut out every piece of fat that we can possibly find and put that in that basket. And once we've cut out all the fat and we think we've gotten it all, we're going to weigh and see how much fat we cut out. So if we had a person that weighed 200 pounds before we started this process, and then we cut out every bit of fat that we could possibly find through the whole body and put it in a basket, and then we weigh how much fat that is, and they had 50 pounds worth of fat inside of them. Well, if we know that 50 pounds of 200 is 25%, so that person was 25% body fat. And so that's one direct way. We've directly measured how much fat was in their body. The other way to determine direct body fat is probably, I think, in my opinion, a lot cooler way to do it than the first way. And so again, we're going to start with weighing you, figuring out how much you weigh. So let's assume 200 pounds again. And then once we've weighed you, what we're going to do is we're going to throw you into a giant bathtub full of acid, or a giant vat of acid. Now, what happens to tissues when you throw them into like a really strong acid? What happens to them?
Dissolve.
Yeah, they dissolve. So what's going to happen is the body's going to start to dissolve. Everything like your muscle, your tissues, even your bones can start to dissolve if it's strong enough. And so that's going to happen. What happens to fats in liquids typically? Like if you put oil or something in water, what happens to it?
Separate. Oil stays on top.
Yeah, so the oil is going to rise to the top. It'll separate. We'll realize even with strong acids, it's still a lot of water in it. And so what's going to happen is as that body dissolves, all the fat is simply going to float up to the top, and the rest of the body is going to kind of be eaten away. And so once the body's fully dissolved, what we'll do is we'll basically take like a pool style skimmer and scoop all the fat off the top and shake out the acid. And then we'll put that on a scale and see how much that weighs. And so if we do that process, what we've done is we've measured how much fat's there. And so again, a 200-pound person, once they dissolve, we weigh out how much fat was left, and there's 50 pounds of fat. Well, we know that they're 25% body fat. So these are both of the direct methods that we have to assess percent body fat or body composition. What is wrong with those two methods?
You have to kill the person to like get that percentage. Like no one's gonna live going through either of those processes.
Yeah, so technically we don't kill them to do the process. That's called murder. But this process does actually happen. People donate their bodies to science, but as you said, that they're dead or will be dead by the end of this process. And so if you know that you're 25% body fat through this method, what good does that do you if you're dead, right? We can't go back and change that now. It's just kind of a way for scientists to assess different ways to measure this. It's how we come up with these indirect methods that we'll talk about in a second. And it's really more of an informational thing. It doesn't do you any good because, well, you're dead at that point. It's great. I know that you're 25% body fat. Who else does that matter for? So yeah, that is done, and it's used as a way to make sure other methods are correct. But again, it's not done like all the time. It's kind of here and there. And so that was great points. And so what we do have is we have indirect methods of assessing your body composition or your percent body fat. These methods don't require you to be dead or be killed in the process. And they're accurate, but they're not quite as accurate. They get really close to the direct methods, but at the end of the day, an indirect method is simply a really, really good estimate of how much body fat you have, because we can't physically go in and remove that fat to make sure we know the exact number. So they use concepts and principles and science to estimate in a really good estimate of what your percent body fat is. And most of these are, they're tested against this direct body fat. So maybe they take a person and do one of these indirect methods from them after they've died, and then they do their direct method to see how accurate they are. And so we've got several different types. Each of them, again, there are some advantages and disadvantages to all five of the methods we'll talk about. And we'll kind of just go from there. So with our indirect methods, that estimation of body fat, most of these are pretty accurate. The first one we want to talk about is what we call underwater weighing. Underwater weighing, literally by the name, is where we weigh you underwater, and this helps us to determine your percent body fat. So again, this process starts by weighing you on land. After that, there's usually, think about like a very large bathtub is kind of what it is with water in it. And in that water, there is a chair. And so you get in the water and kind of sit in this chair. And this chair is attached to a scale. And so what we want to do is figure out how much you weigh underwater. So you'll breathe all the air out of your lungs. So this process starts by you have to breathe all the air that you can out of your lungs. And then you put your head fully underwater. So you make sure you're fully submerged underwater while sitting in this chair, and you try to stay as still as possible. And while that's going on, someone is looking at the scale that's attached to this chair and seeing how much you weigh underwater. You'll have to do this process usually somewhere between 10 and 20 times because when you put someone underwater and you try to weigh them, it's not the most comfortable process. And so we want consistent measurements as we do that. So thinking about this process, if we weigh someone underwater, let's say I make a clone of myself. So I have me and myself, and we're exactly identical. We weigh the same height, everything, except the fact that, let's say, I have a low percentage of body fat, and my clone has a high percentage of body fat. Who do you think would weigh more underwater? Me with a low percentage of body fat, or my clone with a higher percentage of body fat?
You with the lower percentage of body fat.
Yeah, so me with the lower percentage of body fat is going to weigh more underwater. And the reason for that is what happens to fat in water?
It floats.
It floats, right. So the more fat someone has, the less they'll weigh underwater because it's pulling them up to the surface. And so this is the concept that underwater weighing uses. Why do you think it's important for someone to breathe all the air out of their lungs before they go underwater?
Air also helps make you float. So if you breathe in a lot of air, it's easier for you to float than if you don't.
Right, exactly. So that air is gonna make you weigh less underwater. So we try to breathe all the air out of the lungs to give a more accurate measurement. This particular test, as you can probably tell, is one of those that is kind of cumbersome because you got to have a big, body of water that you can submerge into. It also takes about 3 or 4 trained technicians to do it correctly because someone's got to watch the person, someone's got to kind of measure the how much you weigh underwater, and so it's a little bit cumbersome. But also, does that test sound like it's a lot of fun?
Not really.
Yeah, not really. So we're kind of looking at those particular things because it's not fun to sit underwater as still as you possibly can with no air in your lungs. And so that's one method. We've got our underwater weighing. Another method that we have is called the BOD pod. The BOD pod is a way to measure how much room you physically take up, like how much air are you displacing. And so the BOD pod looks like a giant egg spaceship looking thing. The BOD pod is really simple to run. I could teach all of you guys to run a BOD pod in a matter of minutes. It's basically a computer screen, and you read the directions, and then you hit next. You follow the directions. So it's like have the participant step on the scale. That's the very first procedure in this, is getting their weight. And so you have them step on a scale that's attached, and it takes their weight. You hit next, and then it says open door to BOD pod, and you open the door and hit next, and then it says have the participant get in. And so you just have them get in, and then you hit next. And so it's really simple to do. The computer does all the work for us. The participant, it's really simple for them as well. They simply get to sit inside this BOD pod and just stay still and breathe normal, and the machine will do all the work. So as far as that goes, it's not too difficult when we look at it. And so what the BOD pod does is it takes your weight and it looks at that, and then you get into this BOD pod, and it physically measures how much room you take up. And so how it does this is it knows that when this BOD pod is empty, it knows how much air is in that BOD pod. Once you get in, you move some of that air out of the room, right? Think about like when you sit somewhere, you have moved all the air out of that particular location. And so when you get in the BOD pod, you have displaced and moved air out of it. And so they close the door, and it kind of seals off, and it measures how much air you physically remove from that space. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Good. And so if we have this going on, again, think about if, again, I had me that had a low percentage of body fat and my clone that had a high percentage of body fat. If we both did the BOD pod, right, we weigh the same, all these, who do you think would take up more room? Would it be me with a low percentage of body fat or my clone with a high percentage of body fat that would physically take up more space?
Your clone with high percentage of body fat.
Yeah, so my clone with a high percentage of body fat would take up more space than I would. And the reason for that is fat is less dense than muscle. Less dense than muscle. Fat is less dense than muscle. And so what that means is a pound of muscle might fit in your hand pretty easily. Like it would fit in your hand, you'd be able to hold on to that. But a pound of fat might be much, much bigger than your hand. So it physically takes up more space. And that's what the BOD pod assumption is based on. BOD pod, when it comes to it, there are some issues. First of all, the BOD pod, for it to be most accurate, you're supposed to have no clothing on and actually supposed to be completely hairless. Hair traps air, and that makes it really hard for the BOD pod to differentiate between that and your body. And so hair is a big issue. Now, most people don't want to shave and be completely hairless to get in this, and they want to wear clothes. And so we have certain clothing you can wear that helps mitigate this, like compression style clothing. People wear swim caps and things over their beards and their hair in order to compress the air out. Some hair is more problematic than others. If you have really compact hair that's really straight and doesn't take up a lot of room, it's not going to be as big of a deal as if you have really curly style hair that holds a lot of air in it, kind of think like an afro, how there's a lot of hair in an afro. That could cause more issues and cause it to underestimate your percent body fat. The one big thing with the Bod Pod is it is pretty expensive. It does cost about $70,000 to $80,000 for a Bod Pod. It can't be moved very easily, and weather changes can throw it off a little bit. So if a storm rolls in during the afternoon, you do have to do some things to make sure that it's still accurate. The next thing that we have as far as indirect methods is we have skin folds. Skin folds is one way you may have actually had your percent body fat taken. This would be kind of the pinching method. So some of you in middle school or high school may have had a teacher that measured your body fat by maybe like pinching the skin on your calf and maybe your tricep, so the bottom of your leg and the back of your arm, and measured how thick it was. What skin folds is they take what we call skin fold calipers, and we measure how thick your subcutaneous fat, or the fat right below your skin, is. We measure how thick that is on certain locations in the body, and based on where we take those measurements at, some very specific locations, it's not just anywhere, but some very specific locations, we know that your subcutaneous fat is proportional, meaning there's a ratio to your whole percentage of body fat. And so we can do a math equation that estimates your percent body fat. With skin folds, this is somewhat discomfortable. It's not super uncomfortable, but we do know it is kind of pinching of the skin. And so there is some discomfort that comes along with that. The biggest issue with skin folds that we have is that it takes someone who's very trained in this process in order to get accurate results. So I could have all of you guys try skin folds, and it would be good practice as you're learning, but the measurements that you received wouldn't be much different than if you just tried to guess someone's percent body fat. But after you become trained and you've done a few hundred, maybe a few thousand of these, you can be very, very accurate. Skin fold calipers are relatively cheap compared to these other methods. You can get some that are as cheap as like $10, $20. Your most accurate skin fold calipers out there might cost $500 or $600, which is a whole lot less than like $70,000. And so skin folds are a good way. You can take them, you can travel with them very easily. And so that's something to look at, but they do have to be done very precisely in very specific locations. The next thing we have is called BIA. BIA stands for bioelectrical impedance analysis. Again, that's bioelectrical impedance analysis. And so based on the name bioelectrical, what happens with this system is we use electrical current to measure what your percent body fat is. Based on how long it takes for electrical current to pass through your body, we can estimate your percent body fat. If you've ever had your body fat measured, there's a good chance it was through BIA, especially if it's been done in the last number of years, because this technology has become more widespread. If you've ever stepped on a scale that has some metal circles at the top and the bottom of it, and it estimates your percent body fat, more than likely it was done through this BIA, or bioelectrical impedance analysis model. There are handheld versions that are where you hold on to it, and it's got a little screen in the center. These versions are pretty cheap and available, and they're decently accurate. And we have more expensive options that have you stand on something and hold some handles and have a bigger screen that are more accurate, but they're also more expensive. So these can range from a $20 scale to a $30,000 kind of standalone piece of equipment. And so when we look at BIAs, simply what they do is they measure your body fat percentage based on an electrical current. So it sends an electrical current through your body and times it to see how long that's going to take. So realize when we say electrical current, we're not talking about like a taser where you're sitting there shaking and falling off of this piece of equipment. It's a very low voltage. You wouldn't even feel it. You wouldn't even know it was happening. And at times, like if it sends it through your left foot, at times to take and see how long the electric current takes to get to your right foot. And so based on how long that takes, we can estimate your percent body fat knowing your height and your weight. So again, think about me and my clone. I have a low percentage of body fat. My clone has a high percentage of body fat, but we are exactly the same in every other way. who do you think it would take longer for the electrical current to travel through? My clone or myself?
The one with the higher percentage of body fat.
Yeah, so my clone, the one with the higher percentage of body fat, it would take longer. And the reason for that is if we look at fat, fat is mostly fat. So like fat cells themselves, I know that's kind of weird to say, fat cells are like 95, 99% fat. What is the main thing in your, let's say, muscles or your other tissues? What's the number one component of other tissues in your body? We would say that like 60% of your body is made up of this particular substance.
Water?
Yeah, water. So water is the main ingredient of those other things. Does electricity move well through water?
Yeah, it moves very quickly through water.
Yeah, so electrical currents move very quickly through water. If you're not so sure about this, later on, just go take a bath. So the next time you take a bath, you might as well make some toast while you're in the bath, because what says that you bath time like toast. But instead of making that toast beforehand, take that toaster with you into the bath and then just drop that toaster in while you're making toast. Please don't do this. Don't do it at all, because what you'll find out is that electrical current traveled through that water, and that could kill you. So don't do that. But you would see very quickly that electricity travels well through water. And so with that BIA, that's what it's looking at, is we know that the more fat you have, the less water's in that. And so it slows down that electrical current, so it would take longer. Be aware that there are some things that could throw this off. So if you are dehydrated, it could throw the results of this test off. If you have a full stomach, so you'd just eaten, depending on what you ate, could throw that off. If you have a full bladder, that could be something that adds more water into your body and throws these things off. Or various things that throw off how much water's in your body could definitely make the results a little less accurate. Finally, what we have is we have what we call the DEXA. Now, DEXA stands for Dual Energy X-ray Absorptiometry. Dual Energy X-ray Absorptiometry. This particular system is probably the one where we have the least amount of air. There's not a whole lot that can throw off the DEXA. This test is super, super simple to run. There's this giant table with like an arm over the top of it. And so what happens is the only instructions you have is on this table. There's this white box, and you have to get someone to lay on this table and fit inside the white box. I could probably teach my dog how to run a DEXA if he would get you to lay down and just kind of use his nose to push you inside this white box. It's pretty simple to get in. And once you're inside that, all you have to do is hit enter on this computer that's a few feet away. Once that happens, the machine's going to do all the measurement. It's going to have this arm that goes from your head to your toe and has this little thing that goes back and forth. And what it's doing in that system that takes about 10 minutes, the scan takes about 10 minutes, is it uses two types of x-rays, and it measures how they bounce off of your body, and is actually able to tell you how much fat you have, how much non-fat you have, or fat-free mass, and how much bone is in every square centimeter of your body from head to toe. And so with this particular system, it's super accurate because we can't really hide anything from x-rays. There's not a lot that throws it off. The computer does all the calculations, and this system is very accurate and gives us a lot of good information. We can even tell you how much fat is in your right arm versus your left arm. And if you lose weight, well, how much of it was fat versus how much of it was fat-free mass, and where actually did we lose it? Did we lose it from our hips? Did we lose it from our stomach? Did we lose it from our legs? And so this is a really good system to do. What do you think the big issue with the DEXA is? Why hasn't everyone had a DEXA to figure out their body composition?
Is it an expensive machine to use?
So yeah, the machine itself is pretty expensive. It costs somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000. A typical scan in a hospital using a DEXA would cost maybe $1,000 or so. If you found this on like kind of at a university where you could pay to have this test done, it would probably be around $100. A DEXA also, let's say, I know some of you guys are doing well for yourselves, so maybe you've got $100,000 lying around and you want to buy a DEXA. You can't just buy one for your home either. It has to be housed in a medical facility or a research facility like a school. And so this is kind of some of the issues with it. It's very accurate. It's very easy to run, but it's really expensive, and it does take up a good bit of room as well. It takes up, kind of think about the size of a bed when you look at it at the end of the day. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Good. So with that being said, we have all these things, and we've looked at these percent body fats and how we assess them. But at the end of the day, sometimes you might still not have access to these things. Your average person may not have access to one of these methods that gives some decent accuracy. And we don't always necessarily need that percent body fat, but we do want to know more than your BMI, like how much you weigh compared to your height. That doesn't give us all the information. And so we have other things that would not necessarily, they're kind of field test-ish when it comes to this percent body fat, but they're not going to give you that exact number. They're going to be indications of what else is going on inside the body. And so one of those might be your waist circumference. Literally, how many inches around is your waist? And so if we measure that, how many inches or centimeters around is your waist, we can start to figure out more about how your weight is affecting maybe your health. If you had a healthy percentage of body fat, well, we know that your waist is going to be a little bit smaller because muscle and things like that take up less room because they're more dense than fat. If you have excess amounts of body fat, we know that your waist circumference tends to grow above a certain mark. And so a certain size waist circumference would indicate that maybe you have some more risk for health problems as it relates to too much body fat. And so we can literally use that waist circumference. Guys, it's pretty easy. Usually it's kind of your pant size, like literally men's pants are measured like 34, means 34 inches in waist size. Females, it's a little bit more difficult because I don't know what's going on with pant sizes in women. So like what is an 8? And I didn't know you could have anything below a 0, but there's a double 0. But you basically just take a tape measure around that area. The other thing you have here is your hip to waist ratio. And so your hip to waist ratio is looking at how big around is your waist compared to how big around is your hips. We know that if your hips are bigger than your waist, that you're more pear-shaped and there are less health problems than if your waist is bigger than your hips and you're more apple-shaped because you're holding that weight around the abdomen and inside the internal organs. And so these are things that we're kind of constantly looking at and trying to figure out as we go. Other ways for us to assess your health as it comes to your weight and measurements that we can do very easily as compared to some of these percent body fat measurements that may be a little bit more difficult to obtain. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, you're going to get those results and you're going to see those things. And so what do we do once we know our percent body fat and we kind of have all of this information? Well, at the end of the day, it's really simple. You're just simply going to use your results to set goals. We want to set a goal to fall in that healthy range of body fat that we've talked about. And we want to look at those things